Hello, everyone. Welcome to Connecting with Ideas, CWI 101. What are the chances? Today we will spend some time in Higbee's memory book, and I'll remind you to continue reading the memory book that I posted in course documents. I originally, when I posted it, I mentioned that have it done by such and such a date, and so you can plan your own self how long that will take you. It's a quick read. It's a fun book to read. You kind of don't want to do it all at once. You want to spread it out a little bit. I think you'll learn more from it that way. Then what we want to do today is go back to Professor Higbee's memory book that we talked about. We started in last time. So we have two different memory books, one that you are reading and you can find it in Blackboard course documents. That's Harry Lorraine's Page a Minute memory book, and you're reading that over the next several weeks. And then this Higbee book, it is an excellent book, and I would recommend reading it. You don't have to read it for this course. I'm going to give you a lot of stuff from it in our lectures. So what are we talking about here? Today we are talking about long-term memory, and we can say there are three types of long-term memory. So this is Higbee's view. This is the way he does it, and depending on which book you read, and Higbee is very, very authoritative. In the back of the book, he has about 35 pages of footnotes because he is, after all, a professor. He really knows this stuff. Harry Lorraine is an expert in memory. He's an expert in the use of memory, and he's also much more of a popularizer. And so his book, it doesn't have footnotes, but it will help you learn to develop your memory. Higbee will help you learn to develop your memory because he will give you some things about your memory that you otherwise wouldn't know. He's a lot more scientific and psychological about it. So he points out in his very authoritative book that different memory researchers like to categorize these things differently. And I've seen books on memory. There's one in our library that says there are 4 types of long-term memory. And I've seen others that clump them together and say 2. But 3 is a nice compromise. And he has 3 types here. The first one is procedural, remembering how to do something. And examples that he gives are skills such as typing or solving a quadratic equation. And so you think of math, and if you have something that takes some steps, then yeah, that's a procedural memory. Higbee doesn't say it, but in my mind, I think of typing, I guess it requires some memory. It's a lot of practice. To me, it almost feels like a muscle skill. Lately, I've noticed, and I can't recall noticing this 10 years ago or 20 years ago or when I was a kid, and maybe just because I've never actually done it. Usually when I work, I'm at school at my office instead of here in my basement. But what I found is that if I sit down at my piano, which happens to be in my basement about 3 feet away, I'm touching it. Yeah, I can touch it from here. If I sit and play the piano for 2 or 3 hours and then I move over and put my hands on the keyboard, I have a little bit of trouble. I think there's some interference going on. It's like, wait, is this where do my fingers go? And I'm a pretty good touch typist, I think, because of my piano playing. My fingers, all my dexterity is in my fingers. I used to get teased about it when I was younger. As far as walking and chewing gum, probably not. But if it's something with my fingers, I can probably do it, and probably do it very well. Enough of that. Number 2. The second type of long-term memory is semantic memory, and this is remembering actual information. And so procedural is remembering how to solve a quadratic equation. Semantic memory might be the formula for a quadratic equation, right? It could be a math formula. It could be the meaning of a word, right? So if you're taking a Spanish class or a German class or a French class, Japanese class, whatever it is, it could be when the Civil War took place, 1861 to 1865. It could be what's the capital of Germany? And you think, oh yeah, the capital, I should know that. Yeah, capital of Germany. Anyway, those are semantic memory. These have especially, there's no connection to time or place. And so here you don't remember when or where you were when you learned, I certainly don't remember. I do know the capital of Germany, but if you said, well, when did you learn that? I would say in school, maybe. I mean, I must have learned it in school, and well, when in school? I don't know, third grade, fourth. I have no idea. I really don't have any idea. I can remember in sixth grade, I had a good friend, and in the social studies class, we used to play this game. We would finish our work, and then there was a big world map that hung from this stand, and we would say the name of a country, and then my friend or me, depending on who said the name of the country, the other one would say the name of the city and point to it, touch it as fast as they could. We would see how fast we could do this. So countries and their capitals. And I don't know if I could do it now. I mean, I'm sure I knew them better then. I know I'm pretty good now, but no, I'm sure I knew them better then. So there's semantic memory, things we don't remember where we learned them, but they're factual. And then this third one, this is where we do remember when and where it happened, because this is episodic memory, and this is remembering personal events, things that actually happened to you. Or if you do remember when and where you were that you learned the capital of Germany, well, that's an episodic memory. So these are three different types of memory, and to some extent people are a little different in these. I think that my semantic memory is probably my best, and procedural is probably second, and my episodic is probably the worst. And I don't mean that it's bad. I can remember things from my childhood, but different people have different strengths. My brother, I'm just using him as an example. His semantic memory is not as good as mine, although he's smarter than he thinks he is. His procedural memory is very good. He knows how to do all kinds of stuff. And his episodic memory is fabulous. Sometimes I joke, his episodic memory is so good that he remembers things that never even happened. Yeah, so that's how I tease him. What's the difference between long-term and short-term memory? And we talked about these, I think, just a little bit in the earlier lecture. So here they are. They have different nerves, right? There are actually different places in the brain where long-term and short-term memory are done. And the nerves work differently. They're almost different types of nerves, and you'd want to talk to a neurologist or a medical doctor to know more about that, a neurologist. But the nerves are different, and we know this for different reasons. We'll talk about them in a minute. Short-term memory is active, ongoing process. It's an active, ongoing process. It's easily disrupted. We talked about that before. Long-term memory, not as easily disrupted. So if you tell me your phone number and I'm trying to remember it long enough to write it down, I can say it over and over. 228-1024, 228-1024, 228-1024. And if while I'm doing this, someone says, hey, is today the 14th or 15th? I say, oh, shoot. And then it's gone, it's disrupted. But if someone says, when was the American Civil War? I say 1861, and they say, is it today the 14th or the 15th? And I say 61 to 1865, and it's not disrupted. I'm not going to mess up my memory of a historical date that I know pretty well because it's in my long-term memory. Number 3 difference is, we've talked about this already, short-term memory has a limited capacity, no known limit for long-term memory. So I like to say there's no limit, and of course there is a limit because your brain has a certain number of neurons and a certain number of synapses, and well, that must be a limit on your memory. But no one's ever found the limit. No one's ever been able to measure it. We don't know that there is a limit, and there, for all practical purposes, isn't. This fourth one is interesting. Retrieval. Oh, and for short-term memory, limited capacity, remember it's like 5 plus or minus 2, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 things like that. Retrieval from short-term memory is automatic, an automatic process. You don't have to do anything to remember whatever I said, 228-1024. See, that's not really even my short-term memory. That went into long-term memory. The 228 I remember because it's kind of a pattern, and the 1024 I remember because, well, it's 2 to the 10th power. Yeah, I'm a math guy, and so if I see a number 1024, oh, I know that number. That's 2 times 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 2. Multiply 2 together 10 times and you get 1024. Yeah, so that made it really, really easy. Retrieval from short-term memory is automatic. Long-term memory, on the other hand, can have retrieval problems. We will talk about them very shortly when we talk about why is it that we forget stuff. And the fifth, drugs, some drugs, alcohol, some alcohol, that's a drug, I guess. Drugs and diseases affect them differently. So there are drugs that can mess up your short-term memory. Maybe you've had experience with them. I don't want to hear about it, but maybe you have. Some drugs will mess up your long-term memory, right? And diseases similarly. There are various lesions that can occur, injuries to the brain, physical problems with the brain that affect memory differently. Think of Alzheimer's, and what it affects. There's a very, very famous case, a fellow, he's British, he's in his 80s. I don't mean this in a negative way, but I'm surprised he's still alive. His life is not a happy one. His name is Clive Wearing, spelled W-E-A-R-I-G. And sometimes, this isn't a polite thing to say, but sometimes he's referred to as 30-second Clive, because that's how long his episodic memory lasts, 30 seconds. And so he's been hospitalized for the last 30, 40 years. It was a disease, herpes viral encephalitis. So he got this brain disease, and what it did was destroyed the ability for his episodic memory to create new memories. And so his short-term memory is there. He can have a conversation with you, and you can say, "Hey, Clive, how are you doing?" And he says, "I'm doing fine." And we know that that ability to understand language is partly dependent on short-term memory. "What have you been up to today?" "Oh, nothing. I just woke up from a coma." And he says that every day because he does think that he's just woken up from a long coma. And you talk to him for a few more minutes and you realize he has no idea what I talked about a minute ago. He has no idea what I talked about 2 minutes ago. If you leave the room and come back after a minute, he says, "Hey, good to see you." He doesn't know that you were just there, right? You step out of the room to go to the bathroom and come back, and he's delighted to see you after so long because he has no new episodic memories. There have been movies made about him and lots of different TV shows. You could Google him and find more about it if you were interested in that. But it shows how his memory is messed up by a disease, and whether it messes up the short-term memory or the long-term memory, it depends on the disease. It depends on the drug. They are different. Higbee gives this diagram. I want to show you this diagram next. And here's this diagram, and I just love this diagram. It explains so much. And if you can think of memory working in this way, here's some information. There's stuff that happens, and it comes in, and where does it come into? It always comes into short-term memory. That's the only place it can come into. Nothing goes directly into long-term memory. So here's this short-term memory. And what you can do, and I did it a minute ago, 2281024, 2281024, you can rehearse this short-term memory. And if you rehearse the short-term memory, then it will stay in short-term memory, 2281024, 2281024. And what happens when you stop rehearsing? Well, you can do one of a couple things. One is you don't code it at all. Remember, there are 3 phases, there are 3 processes of long-term memory. And one of them was coding acquisition. And if you don't code, well, then you forgot the stuff. What was that phone number? I don't know. I never coded it. If you want to think of coding acquisition another way, it's paying attention long enough to notice the thing. It's like, oh yeah. In my situation, because I'm kind of a weird fellow, I noticed some patterns. And so coded, 1024. Oh yeah. I coded that, right? I turned it into something else. And if you do code, then things go into long-term memory. You can also use this short-term memory, so I'm remembering it, right, by the rehearsal. I'm saying 2281024, 2281024. And why am I saying that? So that I can remember it long enough to get close to a piece of paper or my phone, say if I'm keying it in. And in that situation, what I'm doing is I'm retrieving it, right? And I'm retrieving it immediately. This can happen even without rehearsal, right? I say, what are these numbers? 38251. And you say, 38251. Well, you didn't rehearse it. You didn't practice it. There wasn't any rehearsal there, but you did retrieve it immediately. And about 30 seconds later, I've been talking a little bit. I say, what were those numbers? And you go, I don't know. But when I asked you, then you were able to remember it. And so this, if you retrieve it immediately, people say, hey, do you remember that number? And you say, yes, remembered. And there are actually other ways you can forget and remember. Notice we don't have any arrows coming out of long-term memory, but you can have a retrieval failure. We know that retrieval in short-term is automatic. We just had it a second ago. But if retrieval fails in long-term memory, then we say you forgot. What's the capital of Germany? Oh man, I used to know. Nope, I forgot. All right, you had a retrieval failure. And if the retrieval is successful, if you learn something and you retrieve it later, that says retrieved later, then you remembered it. And this is a really nice way to think of how these processes work. You can see where things go wrong. You can see where things go right. It kind of gives you an idea of what to do to fix it. We talked in our myths stuff. It was the one on, is there a secret to a good memory? And what we said was, no, it depends on the circumstances. So Higby gives the example, what's the best golf club to use? Well, what are you doing? Are you teeing off, or are you making a chip shot out of the bunker, or are you putting in on the green? It really depends on what's going on. And similarly, what's the best memory technique to use? And I listed out some things. Well, who's doing the learning? What are you learning? How will remembering be measured? What kind of remembering is required? How long is the remembering needed to be done for? So that third one, how will remembering be measured, is our next topic. So how do psychologists, how do memory researchers measure memory? What are the measures of memory? And there are several here. So one of them is recall. Recall is, I say, what's the capital of Germany? And you say it, and that's recall. And there are two kinds of recall. There's unaided recall, which is what I just asked you to do. What's the capital of Germany? And you say what it is. That's unaided recall. There's also aided recall. Aided recall is way easier. If I say, what's the capital of Germany? And you say, I don't know. Right? You have failed the unaided recall task. And then I say, well, it starts with a B. You say B. Oh, it's Berlin. Well, then you succeeded. You succeeded in the aided recall. Recall is what most people think of as memory. You're in a class. This is why we're studying memory, is you will have many opportunities over the next several years to exercise your memory, to make use of it. And a lot of those memory tasks will be recall. And what I mean is you're on a test or you're just on an assignment, a quiz, but especially tests. They'll ask you stuff like, what's the capital of Germany? What are the 6 causes of the Civil War? What are the things like that? Aided recall is a huge, huge, huge help. If I said, name the first 5 presidents of the United States, you'd say, George Washington. And then you'd probably, most people don't know the presidents. But if I say, hey, the second one's name starts with an A, and you might get Adams out of that. And the third one's name starts with a J, and you think, I don't know. And I say, well, he's on the, I can give you more aids, right? Aided recall. He's one of the 4 faces on Mount Rushmore. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. He's on a nickel. And okay, so these things might help you. So aided recall. My mother uses aided recall. She creates it for herself. And I like giving this example because it says so much about memory. My grandmother, so this is my mother's mother, was horrible at remembering people's names. It was one of her weaknesses. And my own mother grew up in a household where the women do not remember people's names, and she thought that was a thing. And I can remember when I was a boy growing up in Caldwell and seeing my grandmother not know anybody's names and my mother not knowing anybody's names and asking them about it. And my mother said, oh, it's just none of us remember names. And I thought, well, that's dumb. I mean, I thought, why? What? There's something, hereditary in the brain? And the fact of the matter was, I wasn't really good at remembering names either. And that's one of the reasons I asked about it. And later I figured out why. But my grandmother, bless her soul, is long gone. My mother's still around. She's in her 80s and still doesn't remember people's names well because she's never read Harry Lorraine's book, I guess. I should get her a copy. Good idea, Gary. Make a note. Anyway, I have seen her do this. This is the sort of thing I'll give the example. And I've heard her tell this story about how she does it. So she's in the supermarket, right? She's buying something and she's at one end of an aisle and she glances down and she sees a friend of hers that she's known for years and years and years. And instantly she recognizes the face. And she thinks, oh my gosh, what's that lady's name? And so she's walking down the supermarket aisle very, very slowly. She's trying to stretch it out. And she uses this aided recall. And she uses the alphabet. She says A, B, C, and she's walking really slowly, and the lady's walking toward her, and D, E, oh, she's still walking, F, G, H, H, Hattie. And then she goes up to the lady and she says, Hattie, how nice to see you. And the lady thinks, oh, nice. Yeah, Hattie. And my mother uses aided recall for that. And it kind of works, it kind of doesn't. It's not the best method, but she kind of invented that herself. It's not like she read a memory book, obviously. So how do you study recall? So here's kind of a subfield, how to measure recall. And psychologists do this in several ways. One way is free recall. And this is like a lot of your classes. The idea is I'm going to give you 7 causes of the Civil War, and then I'm going to ask you, how many can you name? And that's free recall. And it's the same thing that you do when you go to the grocery store and you're wanting to buy something, and you can remember, oh yeah, there were a bunch of things I had on my list, and if I knew where the list was, I'd have the but what were they? And this is free recall. You're trying to remember as many things as you can from a list of items. You can think of situations in classes where you were called upon to do that. Serial learning. Here you are presented with a list of things one at a time, and can you recall the list in the same order? And so this is the presidents thing, right? Can you name the presidents? Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, the other Adams, John Quincy, Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, Tyler, Polk. Anyway, you do that. That's serial learning. There's a trick to it. I could teach you the trick later. And you've done some serial learning, right? If I say, what's the alphabet? You say A, B, C, D, E, and you know it in order. You've learned it serially. If I said, now do it backwards. What? Nobody learned that. I mean, my guess is that in the 19 of you who are here today, that one of you maybe could do it backwards. And it'd be like, oh, cool. And everyone would go, whoa, do it again. And the reason that person can do it backwards is they practice it backwards. But even myself, I think of myself as kind of smart. I definitely know the alphabet. If you said, do it backwards as fast as you can, it's going to take a couple minutes. It will be a slow, tedious, unpleasant process because I don't know the alphabet backwards. I only learned it forwards. The third method is the paired associate, and this is something else that happens a lot in school. So paired associate method, the idea here is that we will give you pairs of words, and so I say dog, cat, and then I say horse, saddle. And then later on, I say dog, and you say cat. And I say horse, and you say saddle. So this is paired associate. And you can think of this is like memorizing vocabulary in that foreign language class. Perro is dog, and gato is cat. It's also like a lot of definitions that you have to learn. So a couple more examples. Biology class, serial learning. What are the phases of mitosis, right? That's serial learning. You want to do them in order. Interphase, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, cytokinesis. Here you go. There's a trick to that one too. Learning the capitals of states. That's an example of paired associate. I say Washington and you say Olympia. I say Illinois and you say Springfield. Those are all paired associate. So there's recall. That's our first measure of memory. Second measure of memory is recognition. So this is what my mother is pretty good at. She's in the store and she sees the lady and she thinks, oh, I know her, because she recognizes the face. Recognition by and large is way easier than recall. So recognition in your school setting could happen where, what is the capital of Germany? Instead of asking that, which is a recall question, you might have a multiple choice. What is the capital of Germany? A, Paris, B, London, C, Berlin, D, Warsaw. And You have to recognize which one of those is correct. Yeah, when you recognize something, it's like you see that you know it, and that's the Latin, if you want the etymology. Re means again, and cog means to know. You know it again. Oh yeah, I know that. I know it again. That's recognition. Recognition is easier than recall because you don't have to search for the information. It's given to us. All we have to do is be able to identify it. So how sensitive is recognition? So this is an amazing experiment that they did with people. They get a bunch of people, some subjects of this research. They show people 600 pairs of items, and there were words, there were sentences, there were pictures. And they show them to them, here's two things, here's two things, here's two things, 600 pairs. And then a week later, they bring these people in and they show them two pictures or two sentences or two words, and they say, which is the one you've already seen and which is the new one? So here's the deal. For sentences, the correct recognition score was about 88%. For words, it was about 90%. For pictures, it was about 98%. Have you seen this picture before? Yes, and they can do it correctly 98% of the time. And this is why you recognize a person's face, but you don't know their name because names are harder, right? To do the recognition, this is your 98% picture score. But to do the name, that's a unaided recall, right? Unaided free recall. And that's hard. So this is another way of measuring memory, is by recognition. Third method, and this is the one that most people wouldn't think of. Psychologists know about this, so let's talk about it, and that's relearning. And the idea here is they'll do an experiment, and they'll bring someone in and they'll say, memorize the Gettysburg Address, right? So here's the Gettysburg Address, first paragraph. Let's make it simple. So how does that go? 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And that's the first paragraph of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And I probably learned it when I was a fourth grader, and I still remember it. And I could do the beginning of the next sentence, and I could recognize a lot of it, but I never learned the rest. It's only about a 3-minute speech. You'd think I would do it. Maybe that's my new project. Memorize the Gettysburg Address. That could be fun. Anyway, so what they do is they bring people in and they have them learn this, and they time them, and they see how long it takes to memorize the Gettysburg Address so that they can say it perfectly back. And then they have them come in a week later or a month later and they say, hey, do you still know the Gettysburg Address? And an ordinary person will say, I didn't know I was supposed to still remember. No, I forgot it. And most people, yeah, you forget stuff like that. And this happens, and you think to yourself, yeah, stuff I learned first week in my chemistry class, and then it's on the final in week 16, and I'm still supposed to, yeah, you're still supposed to remember it. Oh, well, I didn't know. And so what do you have to do with that week 1 stuff? You spent so much time learning, you have to review it. You have to relearn it. And so in the experiment, they have you memorize the Gettysburg Address and come back a week later and they have you memorize it again so that you can do it again fluently just as you could the first time. And they time how long it takes. And what happens is it takes less time. And the person thinks, well, I don't remember it. Well, obviously you do, or it would take the same amount of time to learn. And so this is the relearning. And relearning is something. Be aware that it is happening and take advantage of it, right? It is not accurate to say that you do not remember something merely because you do not recall it. Information that is available in memory may be inaccessible by recall, but may be accessible by recognition or relearning. So he talks about that. So the tip of the tongue phenomenon, you've all had this. This is kind of a new topic. And this is my mother, right? This is my mother walking down that grocery store aisle and seeing the lady and thinking, oh man, I could say her name. I could just, oh gosh. And my dad does this too. He thinks his memory is going because he's getting old. Gary, when I'm in a conversation, he tells me this almost every time we have a conversation, talk on the phone for a half hour, an hour, and he'll bring up in that time, oh, my memory is just going awful. I'll be having a conversation and I can't think of the word. And the reason it comes up is in the conversation, he can't think of a word. And so he mentions it. Oh man, lately I just can't remember words. And I think to myself, yeah, and when I was a little boy, 5 years old, and you were a lot younger than being 80s, you couldn't then either. And you'd think it was a thing, and so you didn't talk about it. So anyway, that's my dad. He has this tip of the tongue phenomenon. And you've all had it, right? You've all been in a test, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I know the capital of Germany. Oh man, it's the Brandenburg Gate is there, and John F. Kennedy went and gave a speech. Said he was an English muffin. No, he didn't say that. He said something like that. We could talk about it if you wanted. Why does this happen? More than what is, you know what it is, but why does it happen? It happens because memory is not an all or nothing process. We know memory is a process. It's a thing. It's something that happens. And it has lots of different parts, physiological and model. It's not that you remember all of it or you remember none of it, right? You can't remember the name of the capital, but you can remember so much stuff about it. Oh yeah, it was a divided city. There was a Soviet zone, and then there was it was half free, and there was the airlift, the Berlin airlift. Oh, Berlin, yeah, Berlin, there you go. Number 2, most memory, this is an important one, and we will talk about this more. Most memory is generative, not duplicative. Memory is not like a camera. It's not like your cell phone. You go snap, and now you have a picture, and it's a perfect, exact picture. Memory is recreated, right? When you remember stuff, you are creating it anew. And this process of reconstruction, sometimes it's accurate and sometimes it's less accurate. The third reason, words, here we're talking especially about words, the tip of the tongue, right? Words come off your tongue. And so, I mean, you don't have tip of the tongue phenomenon in recognition tasks. Hey, have you seen this picture before? Oh, yeah. And no one says, oh, man, I can almost, yeah, it doesn't happen. This is more semantic. Words may be stored in memory in more than one way. And so think, you can remember the audit term. So Berlin, it's the sound. You might store it, right, how many syllables in visual terms. And so you can kind of see the B is big and then it's low, and then the L is big and then it's low. And so it has this kind of pattern to it. And you might see it that way. You might think of the meaning. So Berlin, well, you store it with Germany in your memory somehow. And you also store it with other capitals, Paris and Warsaw and London and Madrid and Athens, whatever it is. You might think Berlin, oh yeah, it was that songwriter Irving Berlin, or the Berlin Wall, right? And so you store memory in different ways. Number 4, there's a difference between, well, let me tell you the story first. The story is this kid comes to his dad and he says, Dad, if you know where something is it lost? And the dad thinks about it a minute. He says, if you know where something is it? No, it's not lost. If you know where it is, it's not lost. And the kid says, oh, good. Your car keys are down the well. So yeah, I know exactly where the car keys are. They're down the well. Yeah, but does that mean you have the car keys? No. And so Higbee differentiates these. There's a difference between availability and accessibility of information. So it's available, yeah, it's in there, and you could probably pass it as a recognition task, right? Or relearning, we would be able to prove, oh, it took you less time to learn it, and so it must have been in there. It was available. But is it accessible? Can you get to it? And sometimes you can, and sometimes you can't. That finishes a chapter. And so here's chapter 3, and Higbee starts off with these jokes. The patient goes to the psychiatrist. He says, Doc, I need help with a memory problem. I'll be talking to someone, and right in the middle of the conversation, I forget what I'm talking about. And the psychiatrist says, oh, well, how long have you had this problem? And the patient says, what problem? Okay. Oh, and then this is an oldie. I'm skipping the one that's not so funny. There are 3 signs that you're getting senile. First one is you begin to lose your memory. I don't remember the other 2. Yeah, bump. So there you go. Let's look at what's going on in chapter 3. So the title of chapter 3 is Meet Your Memory, How Does It Work? In the first section, I like this section because if you think about it backwards, you can fix it. This is how and why do we forget? And there are different theories. And of course, you think, well, there's different reasons at different times, and you'd be right. But here are some of the theories, some of the reasons that have been given, and some of the reasons that are actually there. Forgetting is easier than remembering. It's a lot easier to forget something than to remember something. And why is that? Because if you think of our model, right, we have, in order to remember, 3 required phases. There's acquisition and coding, there's storage, and there's retrieval. You have to do all 3 things. To forget, you don't have to do 3 things, you only have to do 1 thing. All you have to do is not acquire it, not encode it, or not store it, or fail to retrieve it for any of a number of reasons. So it is easier to forget than to remember. One reason we forget, at least this is a theory that's often given, this is the oldest theory, is that we forget because of decay. The memories are there, but if you don't reinforce them over time, then they kind of wear down. They become weaker and weaker and weaker, and then you don't remember the stuff anymore because it was a long time ago that you heard it. The explanation for forgetting in this model is disuse. It's kind of true. Second theory on why we forget is repression. And this is a Freudian idea, right? You remember Sigmund Freud, the Austrian psychiatrist in the early 20th century. And his idea was that something traumatic happened to you, right? There was that time you were in Berlin and that horrible event took place. And so psychologically, you push that memory down, you hide it, you force it into your subconscious. And someone says, hey, do you remember the capital of Germany? And you just shudder because you don't even know, you don't have any idea because you've repressed it. Unless you actually have gone to Berlin and had a horrible thing happen to you. Typically, repression is, well, for one thing, well, don't get me started on Freud. You can ask me later if you want. I'm much more of an Adlerian than a Freudian. Let's just say that. Even if repression is a good explanation for forgetting, well, it probably doesn't apply to why you can't remember the phases of mitosis in your biology class, right? You didn't have a traumatic experience with an amoeba, and so yeah, it doesn't happen. So we're going to ignore repression in this course because it just doesn't apply to anything we're doing. Distortion. The reason you forget, this goes back, right, in your notes a page to memory is a generative process, not a duplicative process. And so what happens when you generate it, when you reconstruct your memory, is that sometimes you distort it a little bit. And so you remember stuff a little bit wrong. When was the Civil War? And you get one of the numbers wrong, or you mix them up, you might flip them. And distortion is a very, very powerful thing. So Higby gives this experiment, and let's try it. So don't write these down. What I want you to do, you're sitting there listening to my soft, soothing voice. I want you to close your eyes. No, I'm not going to hypnotize you. And don't close your eyes too long because I don't want you to fall asleep. But I'm going to read you a list of words, and then we'll do, what is that? One of those recall tasks, right? A free recall. I'm going to give you a list of words and you're just going to think of them. And then I'll tell you to open your eyes and then you try to write down as many as you can. And we'll see who can write the most. And there's no prize, but encourage you in some way. Here you go. Close your eyes. Here's the list. Bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, night, eat, comfort, sound, slumber, snore. All right, open your eyes and write down as many of those words as you can. I'll give you a minute to do it. Okay, so one of our students, Kay, has already posted the list they had, and it looks as though there were 12 words originally, and Kay has posted 8. Anybody have more than 8? Look at your list. Do you have more than 8? You're wanting that prize. There is no prize. Well, but I still want the prize. Yeah, okay. Anyway, this is a fabulous example. And if you look at the chat window right now and look at Kay's list, it has bed, rest, awake, sleep, slumber, comfort, sound, night, which is fabulous. And I would ask you, how many of you on your lists did have the word sleep? And typically, I do this in classes, I've done it dozens of times. Typically, I get about half the students with the word sleep on their list. Sleep was not one of the 12 words that I read. What? No, but this is the distortion, right? This is your forgetting. You've forgotten what was on the list. Why did you put sleep on? Well, all the words were about sleep. I mean, it made sense. Yeah, of course it's going to be sleep. It should be on the list. This affects what? It affects witness testimony at trials, right? It's very easy with leading questions to have people remember things. What color was the victim's overcoat? And suddenly they remember an overcoat that the victim was not wearing. There's a famous psychological experiment. They do this with students in a class, right? They show a movie. It's like a 2-minute movie of a car crash, an automobile accident. And then they say, pay attention to this movie. There's going to be a little quiz about it. They give all the students a quiz. Well, the quizzes are different. Half the students get a quiz that says, how fast were the cars? One of the questions, how fast were the cars going when the accident happened? And half of the students get a question that says, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? And then later they ask, was there any broken glass at the accident scene? And it's very interesting that way more of the students who had the question with smash remember some broken glass than the students who just had the more neutral word of accident, right? Smash, if there's a smash, well, yeah, there must have been, and there wasn't. In the video, there's no broken glass, but students remember it because, well, there should have been, and not because of anything from the video, but because of the way they were questioned. So distortion. Interference. So this is an interesting one because it kind of seems contrary to one of our myths. One of our myths was there's a limit to how many things you can remember. And we've talked about this several times. Long-term memory has no known limit for capacity. But still there's this interference thing. And the idea here is there are things that you can learn that will make it harder to remember other things. And this can happen proactively or reactively. The new things can affect the old things, or the old things can affect the new things. And the example, my favorite example, Higbee doesn't use it, but I love this example, is suppose that you are in college. Well, you are in college. Suppose you're in college and you are very interested in Romance languages, right? The languages that are descended from Latin. And so you are signed up for Spanish class and you are signed up for Portuguese class. Let me just tell you that Spanish and Portuguese are so similar to each other that you will learn things in your Spanish class that will mess up what you learned in your Portuguese class and vice versa. To a lesser extent, this would happen with French and Spanish, or I can remember taking a French class in high school. And the very first day I was listening to the guy. He was a nice guy. He knew his stuff. He taught French and Spanish, and he was teaching us some French words, and he would say them and we would say them as a class. And we did this for a few minutes. Then he said, muy bien, which means very good, except it means very good in Spanish. He meant très bien, right? He meant very good in French, but he taught both, and he just mixed them up. Well, the next day I switched to German. But anyway, that's another story for another day. So interference does happen. It is a known thing, and there are ways to get around interference, and we'll talk about those later. In fact, all of these things, there's ways of getting around them, and we will talk about them. Once we know why we forget, and forgetting is easier to remember, forgetting is easier than remembering. I don't know who typed this. If you know the opposite thing to do to stop the ways that we forget, then you won't forget. And so for decay, for example, well, we'll recommend a certain style and type and timing of reviewing. And distortion, well, we'll have ways of fighting all of these things. And we'll have one for interference later. So one more reason we forget the how and why is because of what's called cue dependency. And here the idea is, well, let's look. What do we have? We have 3 phases. We have acquisition and coding, we have storage, and we have retrieval. And you can think to yourself, you might go through this list on your own and think, well, which of these is this, right? What kind of failure is this? Cue dependency is strictly a failure of retrieval. You have encoded the stuff, the memory is in there, it's stored, and you just can't get it. And so this relates a little to the tip of the tongue, but it also happens when it's not on the tip of the tongue, when you just think, no, I don't know. And what you need is you'd need just the right cue. And the theory here is if you can find the right cue, then yeah, you can remember anything. And if someone knew, right, the contents of your brain, if they knew how you learned something and where you were, and they could remind you and say, you remember it starts with a B, and you go, nope, I'm not getting it. John F. Kennedy made a speech there. Nope, nope, nope. The Russians stopped all the shipments of food, and so the Americans used to fly in boxes of raisins, right? And they can do that. And eventually, right, the right cue will hit, and you'll remember. And so this is the idea of cue dependency. You need something that will jog your memory properly. I like this example. I got just enough time to read it to you. So to illustrate these 5 explanations of forgetting, let's compare your memory to the attic of a house. You store things in your memory, yep, and similarly you store things in your attic. Suppose you go into the attic to find a specific item. The decay explanation of forgetting would be like a deteriorating room. You cannot find your item because it has been left in the attic so long that it has deteriorated and disappeared. It just dissolved into thin air. The repression explanation would be like a walled up room. Part of the attic is blocked off, so you cannot get into it to find the room. The distortion explanation would be somewhat like a rearranged room. Objects in the attic are all mixed up, so you cannot find the item that you're looking for because things are not arranged as you thought you left them. The interference explanation would be like a cluttered room. The room has become cluttered with other things that get in the way when you try to find your item. The cue dependency explanation would be like a locked room, where the items in the room are locked in chests or drawers or treasure boxes. You must find the right key, that is, you must find the right retrieval cue to unlock the one that contains your item. And then he goes on, and this is important. No single explanation is adequate to account for all forgetting. So each of these 5 explanations does have its place. And it depends, the research, right? Some of it is short-term and some of it is long-term, and some of it is clinical experiences, and some of it is traumatic experiences, and some of it is book learning, and some of it is things like that.